The MIT Alumni for Climate Action Roadmap, a roadmap for responding to climate change, is a 55-plus page document, the first half of which is devoted to providing background on climate change, and the second half is devoted to providing recommendations on how to address climate change. In this presentation, I will briefly summarize the roadmap document, and then I will discuss how the document's recommendations compare with recent budget plans for infrastructure. This slide shows a graphical representation of the roadmap recommendations in the style of a technology roadmap. I will discuss this in a little more detail later, but suffice it for now to say that many complicated projects have to be coordinated and carried out over the next several decades to address climate change. The severity of our future difficulties is directly tied to the amount of temperature change we allow ourselves to cause. Unfortunately, we are in the driver's seat here. If you look back 60 million years, the Earth was a much warmer place. Shown here in this plot are temperatures on a geologic timescale. This time axis is logarithmic. And so you can see tens of millions of years ago, things were much hotter. There was a hothouse and warmhouse phase. And then, after the dinosaurs went extinct and when the early mammals started to form, the planet started to cool. And it cooled through the coolhouse phase into the icehouse phase. And in this icehouse phase, from about 1 million years ago till about 20,000 years ago, there was a periodic steady state to the Earth's temperature. If you plot this on a linear axis, these little spiky things appear as more gentle and periodic, fairly regular, cyclic temperature profiles for the Earth. And as we came out of the last ice age and reached one of these local maximums in temperature, if you will, something reasonably akin to the higher temperatures of previous cycles, the Industrial Revolution started. And so here we are on a local high, if you will, not quite heading down to the next ice age, and we start to emit stuff, which warms the planet. Can't think of a worse time to do that, but here we are. Shown in colored envelopes are projections going forward as to what the temperatures might be if we take specific action through representative concentration pathways. So those pathways represent either doing nothing, like this brown scenario, this brown envelope, or being extremely aggressive, like this purple envelope. And in the business as usual scenario, we do pretty much nothing. We risk warming the planet back up to where it hasn't been in 40 million years or something like that. And back to possibly even a time when there were no polar ice caps. By contrast, if aggressive measures are taken, possibly the temperature change could be limited to 1.5 C. The effort required to go from this RCP 8.5 to RCP 2.6 is quite substantial, but there's a lot at stake here. The costs of the crisis are rising. Severe weather events are becoming much more frequent, be they severe droughts or severe floods from extremely powerful hurricanes. And the problem is that even if we act quickly, we're likely to face increasing cost for a while before things level off and get under control. And if we do nothing, then the costs will become yet more severe as the frequencies will rise even more rapidly. We don't have much time to act, and we have only a limited carbon budget. And this concept of carbon budget is shown in this graph. In order to limit the temperature change to the values shown on the y-axis here, vertical axis, one needs to keep the total accumulated emissions of greenhouse gas below the level shown on the horizontal. So if we want a 2/3 chance of winning, 67% confidence, we follow this solid blue line, and we see that we have only about 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions left within which to come down to net zero in order to limit the temperature change to 1.5 C or lower. To put that in perspective, the global output of greenhouse gas is about 50 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent. So our budget's 300. We have an annual output of 50 gigatons. It's 6 years worth of output to draw everything down to zero. If we started today and drew it down linearly over time, that would give us something like a decade. However, this chart is already a couple years out of date, and we haven't really started drawing things down very quickly. Our reality is that without aggressive progress, limiting warming to 1.5 C is not possible. And warming greater than 1.5 C is a foregone conclusion with business as usual for something like a couple more years. With aggressive measures, which means throw in everything but the towel, don't give up, we might be able to limit warming to 2 degrees C. But if we do what's comfortable and we only take modest measures, limiting warming to 3 C is a stretch, and an outcome of 4 C or higher is a more likely result. So what are the roadmap recommendations? First, we must immediately take essential measures across all sectors of the economy, and second, we are likely to require innovations over the next 2 decades. More specifically, we have 6 recommendations. First is enact net zero or carbon neutral legislation, so things like the infrastructure bills, the Save Our Future Act, and other legislative proposals that have been made to address climate change. All of that is important to get passed and get implemented. We must replace fossil fuels with carbon-free energy, which means we need to build out renewables, we need to build out the electric grid, we need to have R&D for portable green energy sources, for example, green hydrogen. We need to electrify and decarbonize transportation systems. So we need to build out a charging infrastructure and also develop portable green energy sources. We need to improve buildings and communities through efficiency upgrades and providing alternatives to oil and gas heat. We need to reform land management and agricultural practices through afforestation, reforestation, and promoting soil health. And if we are to achieve net zero, we're going to need some form of negative emission technology, for example, carbon capture and sequestration. We'll have to develop large-scale processes to buy time to address the most difficult emissions reductions. So here once again is the roadmap graphic. And in the upper left, we have the legislative area. We have broad objectives like greenhouse gas reduction of 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So those would be the broad targets. Then sector-specific targets that would be required to achieve those broad targets. We would want to eliminate carbon subsidies. We would want to otherwise de-incentivize carbon. We would want to incentivize sustainability. We would want to prioritize the technology investments that are critical to making progress on addressing climate change. And we would want to incentivize a circular economy. All of this would have to be coordinated with an established climate action authority that would help drive progress in all the different sectors. So for instance, the electric power sector would need to adopt wind and solar rapidly, build out grid infrastructure, and develop green hydrogen carriers. The transportation sector would also have to have build out of infrastructure such as charging infrastructure. There would also have to be zero emission fuels, or otherwise known as energy carriers. The things we know how to do today, such as hybrid vehicles and EVs and ZEVs, should be implemented and scaled up. In the residential and commercial building sector, we would need to eliminate high global warming potential gases from heating, ventilation and air conditioning systems and appliances. And we would need to improve energy efficiency of buildings and appliances. In the industrial sector, we would also want to improve energy efficiency of buildings and appliances as well as industrial processes. We would also need things like green hydrogen carriers. We would need to eliminate high global warming potential gases from the HVAC systems in industry, as well as appliances and industrial processes. Then you've got the forests that need to be sustained. We need to eliminate deforestation, implement afforestation and reforestation. The forests are basically our natural carbon capture and sequestration systems, and they far outperform anything we can build. And they are precious, and we need to grow them. In the agricultural sector, we need to eliminate high global warming potential gases, such as methane. We need to implement sustainable agricultural practices and improve soil health. And then we need to deploy carbon capture on large scale. So we need to think about natural processes and industrial processes that can be scaled up to achieve this capability, and then implement it and use that capability to offset emissions from processes that are still difficult to make net zero. So what we have before us is a massive engineering challenge intertwined with a public policy challenge, all wrapped up in a geopolitical challenge. And the IPCC 2021 report is clear on the urgency of our situation. Legislation alone will not adequately address the crisis. Market forces alone will not move us to a solution with sufficient speed. We must address the crisis with manufacturing capacity, tools, and methods needed to fight a war against an existential threat. Those who balk at the price tag for addressing the climate crisis are either ill-informed as to its severity or disingenuous in their purported concern. So we need to act. The time for talk has long passed. We need to have an authority drive all the various agencies and branches of government to make progress on this incredibly difficult and existential challenge. So what are the requirements for substantive climate action? I mentioned this Climate Action Authority. We believe at MACA that is absolutely needed. We need to make a significant dent in global greenhouse gas emissions immediately. We need to start here in America. So make a dent in greenhouse gas emissions through things like Clean Cars for America, immediate build out of carbon-free, low-carbon, and energy-efficient infrastructure across all sectors of the economy. And we need to have appropriate international trade policies. I mentioned global greenhouse gases. Well, it's a world problem, and if we're to get the world to partner with us and achieve the same objectives, we need appropriate international trade policies, including things like border fees, disincentives for carbon, onshoring more of our manufacturing sector is needed, and developing and exporting green technology. So those are absolutely critical things. We also need to address agriculture and land use practices, and we need to craft sector-specific targets and drive progress in each sector of the economy that's responsible for greenhouse gas emission. We need to provide incentives and support for research and development of needed technologies to address the crisis on a global scale. Now we have the Senate Democrats' budget proposal for infrastructure, which is basically the America Jobs Plan plus possibly the Save Our Future Act. And these things do have key features that the roadmap absolutely recommends, like the broad goal of 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 and net zero by 2050. and the issue of dealing with dislocated workers, having a dislocated workers program and sector-based training. Those two things are very strongly aligned with what MACA recommendations are. When you look at the details in the proposal, eliminating tax preferences for polluters, implementing a greenhouse gas tax such as a carbon price with dividend, providing incentives for green energy, providing grants and incentives for EVs, support and funding for restoration and resilience projects, support for agricultural resource management and climate smart technologies, and so on, investing in carbon capture. All of these things are mentioned, but the implementation is rather passive. It's through incentives, and it's not driven by a climate action authority. So that's one problem we see to making things happen quickly, is implementing things in such a passive manner. And then if you want to nitpick, the idea of using carbon capture and sequestration to offset emissions from power generation is completely a red flag. That's something MACA recommends against. Power generation can be done in a carbon-free way, and using carbon sequestration to offset something that for which we have a solution today is not the right use of that precious yet to be developed technology. It needs to be used for those stubborn industrial processes perhaps, or other things where we're having trouble getting that last 10% of our net emissions down. So that's kind of an overview of where the MACA recommendations align and to what extent they align with current proposals under consideration in Congress. So in summary, the problems have been known for decades, and the protracted decades-long debate has left us little time to act. We must take bold action now.